You're a loser. You're dumb. You're shy. You're lazy. Labels. Raise your hand if you have ever been labeled before. As a child, I was definitely labeled. My parents noticed I wasn't progressing like the other kids were, and they took me to the doctor. The doctor said, well, your son has ADD, short-term memory, and dyslexia. And he's unfortunately what we call here in the medical community an idiot. But for that reason, I am today's expert speaker on the topic of the idiot's recipe for success. Now, as I mentioned, growing up, I had some challenges. In preschool, I was actually held back. And even at that age, I knew that was not a good thing. At that same school, I was getting bullied. And my parents decided it would be a good idea for me to move to a new school. And so I went to a new school. And the kids there were really nice, and they were smart, and they were funny, and I loved going there. And there was one kid there especially. His name was Jeff. He was the coolest kid in our grade, and he was a real leader. And I remember one weekend I wanted to hang out with him. So I called his house, his mother picked up, and I asked if Jeff could hang out. And she said, well, Jeff's at basketball tryouts. I said, basketball tryouts? If Jeff's at basketball tryouts, then I need to go to basketball tryouts. So me and my mom, we drove down there. I tried out for the team, and I made it. Woo! Give it up. Well, all right, not that big of a deal. Everybody makes the team back in those days, so all right. But a few years later, Jeff and I were asked to try out for a travel team, which is a more advanced basketball team that goes across the country, plays different states, and we really wanted to make that team. Because that meant on the weekends, we got to hang out with our friends, go travel across the country, and play basketball. What more could you want? But after I tried out for that team, I remember my mom sitting me down and telling me that I didn't make the team. And I remember being devastated, and I really wanted to quit. Now, luckily, my mother was there to convince me otherwise, and she helped me to keep going. And what I learned from her there was the first ingredient for success, which was to never quit after a bad day. If you have a good day and you don't enjoy what you're doing, move on, do something else. But you never quit when you're down. Then she asked me a question. She said, do you believe that you can become a great basketball player? I said, I do. And that was the second ingredient. You must believe it before it can become a reality. And then she said to me, well, good. Then use this tough situation and any tough situation that you come across as motivation to get to the next level when you experience that in life. And that was the third ingredient. Find your motivation and get clear on your why. Now that weekend, as all the other kids were out playing basketball across the country, I was at home watching basketball on TV. And I remember a documentary coming on a player named Ray Allen. Now, Ray Allen is considered one of the greatest NBA shooters of all time. And I remember the way he talked about his routine, his regimen, the way that he practiced. And in my mind, it was all so simple. All I had to do was come up with a great routine, and I could become almost as good, just as good, or maybe even better than him one day. And so that's what I decided to do. I set a routine to shoot 1,000 shots a day. And that routine took me about 2.5 to 3.5 hours every single day. And when I started that routine, I was making around every 1 out of every 10 shots. But as time went on, 1 out of 10 turned into 2 out of 10, turned into 3 out of 10, turned into 4, turned into 5, and eventually I tried back out for that travel team, and I didn't make it again. But here's what I found out. I found out that if I focused on just getting a little bit better each and every day, then I could eventually become good at anything I wanted to. And so I saw how this was working with basketball, but I wanted to try it in other areas of my life. So I thought to myself, what have you always wanted to do? And I thought about it, and I said, well, I've always wanted to play the drums. My father is an incredible drummer, and he was actually the drummer for the church that we attended when I was growing up. As I mentioned, I was not one of those naturally gifted children who can just do anything. In fact, I was so unnaturally gifted that one day in church, I remember I was clapping along to the songs, and I remember my mom kneeling down next to me, and she said, son, I don't know how else to tell this to you, but the other families in the church have asked me to ask you to stop clapping. You're getting everyone out of rhythm. And so that was my start in music. And then something else happened. One day at school, I was wearing a sleeveless shirt. And I remember a classmate of mine coming up to me and saying, hey, you're not allowed to wear that shirt. I said, what do you mean? He said, you don't have any muscles. You're not allowed to wear that shirt. Don't ever wear that shirt to school again. I said, okay, let's try it with this. And as time went on, and I started to put these ingredients for success into place, what I started to notice is that I was doing things that my peers and the other kids weren't doing. My senior year for basketball, we played the #1 team in the entire state of Arizona, and I scored 27 points against them. For drumming, I went from being told to stop clapping in church to having the church that I was attending ask me to drum for their biggest service of the entire year for over 2,000 people. And for working out, I went from being told to stop wearing a sleeveless shirt to by the time I was 18 years old, I was training over 15 clients on how to get in shape. Now, as I got a little bit older, I really started to fall in love with basketball. And I said, this is what I want to do. I want to become a professional basketball player. And so I pushed all of my chips in. I said, this is what I'm going to do. But as my senior year was coming to a close, no college teams were calling me to play for their schools. That was until the phone rang. And when the phone rang, it wasn't just any school. It was the University of Arizona, one of the top basketball universities in the entire country. And they said, we saw what you did in high school. We want you to come try out for our team. Head on down to Tucson. We want to see what you got. And I was ecstatic. I was so excited. I hung up the phone. I ran right over to the other room and I told my mom, I said, I have the most exciting news. I just got asked to try out for the Wildcats. And she said, that's amazing. And then she asked questions like, where is the tryout? And when is the tryout? I'm like, I don't even know. I just ran over here to tell you. And she said, well, go call him back. So I ran back to my room and I called him back and then on the other end, I just heard laughter. And I realized that it was just a couple of kids who were playing a joke on me. As my senior year ended, I stopped playing basketball and I started to become depressed. I was attending a community college that I thought was way beneath me, and I was failing all of my classes. I remember one day driving home from school and pulling into a mall parking lot. And I just sat there in my car and cried. And when I was done crying, I remember looking up and seeing an incredibly tall building in front of me. And the idea of jumping off that building came across my mind. Now, as I got home later that night, and I walked in the house, I remember my father seeing me, and he saw I wasn't doing well. He said, "Let's go shoot some baskets." I said, "Okay." So we went outside, and after a couple of shots, I put the ball down, and I said, "Dad, I feel like I'm a total failure. I feel like I can't do anything, and I feel like everyone is looking at me and saying, 'What a loser.'" And I told him about that thought I had of earlier that day of jumping off that building. My father, he started to cry. And I started to cry. And he came over to me, and he embraced me, and he hugged me. And then he gave me the final missing ingredient that I needed so badly. He said, "Son, no one cares about you as much as you think that they do." And when he said that, it all made sense. What he was not saying was that nobody loved me or that nobody cared about me. What he was saying was that people were focused on themselves. They were not paying attention to what I was doing 24 hours a day. And in that moment, I realized I was free and I could do anything that I wanted to. And so instead of quitting when I was down in college, I went back. And I went from having all failing grades to eventually passing with exceedingly high grades. After college, I got into sales. When I got into sales, I was terrible. They considered firing me at the end of each week for the entire first year. But I focused on getting a little bit better. And I eventually became the #1 sales trainer in that entire company. After that, I got into real estate. And people said, "You shouldn't do that or you won't be successful in that." And I didn't listen to what they said. I focused on my destiny and what I wanted to do. And again, I was terrible at it, but I focused on those ingredients for success. And I eventually went from selling $0 a year in real estate to around $10 million a year in real estate, year after year after year. By the time I was 25, I had enough money that I could retire. But my greatest accomplishment of them all was that I convinced the most incredible woman in the entire world into marrying me. We are all labeled in life. Have you been letting your labels hold you back? Take this idiot's recipe for success and create the life that you have always dreamed about. If I can do it, then you can do it. Just follow the recipe.